The legacy media directs your attention to kinetic threats, troop movements near Aden, per Anadolu Ajansı. This is a deliberate misdirection. The calculus of modern warfare has shifted from kinetic cost to systemic leverage. A missile is loud, expensive, and invites a predictable, overwhelming response. It is a liability, not an asset, for a strategic adversary. The primary vector is not an explosion. It is silence. Analysts at RUSI and CSIS have repeatedly warned that 97% of global data, including trillions in daily financial transactions, travels through a handful of vulnerable undersea cables. These are the arteries of the global economic system. The second vector is orbital, satellite blinding. Severing GPS and high-frequency communication doesn't just disrupt navigation, it freezes the digital dollar. It paralyzes the entire command, control, and commercial infrastructure of a superpower. The kinetic cost is near zero. The strategic return is total. This protocol is designed to create a specific outcome: the blind Leviathan, a superpower armed with unparalleled kinetic force, but with its digital central nervous system severed. It possesses aircraft carriers it cannot command, a currency it cannot transact, and allies it cannot contact. In a state of systemic paralysis, with its economic leverage gone and facing internal warnings of collapse, like those now emanating from Germany, the blind Leviathan has only one remaining tool. Its response protocol defaults to a launch-on-warning posture. This is the strategic trap, forcing the target to initiate its own kinetic escalation, turning a regional conflict into a vector for systemic global war. Wars of choice are a luxury of solvent nations. When a state's domestic liabilities exceed its capacity to pay, its strategic calculus shifts from opportunity to survival. The motive for conflict ceases to be geopolitical gain and becomes a brutal exercise in balance sheet management. According to CSIS analysis, the war in Ukraine is not an exception, but a case study. It is framed as a solvency crisis. The Kremlin faced a mathematical certainty. A demographic decline coupled with unsustainable social obligations created a terminal domestic liability. RUSI reports confirm the war, while unpopular and a drain on conventional assets, serves a critical function. It converts a diffuse, politically radioactive economic problem into a singular, unifying national security crisis. This is a non-optional pivot to asymmetry. Unable to compete on economic terms, the state forces a kinetic competition to defer its own systemic collapse. This weakness forces the adversary's hand. It is a launch-on-warning protocol against internal implosion. The objective is not territory, but to impose a kinetic cost on a rival superpower whose own solvency is eroding. Ray Dalio's stark warning of USD trust erosion, evidenced by gold surge, confirms this vulnerability. The contagion is systemic. Germany's chancellor now openly warns of economic collapse for the industrial engine of Europe. The motive is to exploit this fragility. By initiating regional fires from Ukraine to the Red Sea, where Yemeni forces escalate conflict near Aden, the adversary forces the declining superpower to expend its remaining financial and military liquidity. As the United States issues Level 3 travel warnings, it signals a reduced capacity to enforce global order. The motive is to bleed the hegemon, transforming manageable regional conflicts into vectors for a global systemic solvency crisis, where the superpower's only remaining leverage is the one its adversaries are waiting for: direct kinetic escalation. The entire strategic calculus has been inverted by a single mathematical reality. A Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, analysis codifies the fatal economics. A $5 million main battle tank can be permanently neutralized by a $500 first-person view drone. This is a 10,000 to 1 cost disparity. It is not a battlefield equation. It is a bankruptcy protocol. This asymmetric cost structure is the accelerant. For every dollar an adversary spends on a kinetic attack, the declining superpower must spend $10,000 to either defend or replace the asset. This creates a state of permanent economic attrition. The superpower bleeds capital, hardware, and political will defending against attacks that are, for the adversary, financially insignificant. This phenomenon is known as the democratization of violence. High lethality kinetic capability is no longer the exclusive domain of nation-states with trillion-dollar budgets. It has been decentralized, commoditized, and placed in the hands of non-state actors and regional powers for the price of consumer electronics. This is the ultimate weapon against a system suffering a systemic solvency crisis. The adversary does not need to win militarily. They only need to make the cost of projecting power prohibitively expensive, forcing the incumbent into a strategic trap of kinetic escalation or total withdrawal. The Level 3 travel warnings issued by the United States are not a public service announcement. They are a systemic map of emerging gray zones, areas designated as permissible arenas for asymmetric conflict. These zones are deliberately destabilized to serve as proxy laboratories for strategic attrition. Examine the operational blueprint in Yemen. The escalation toward Aden, as confirmed by Anadolu Ajansı, is not random chaos. It is a live-fire test of a superpower's response protocols when its economic leverage has been nullified. The kinetic cost of intervention is measured against the political cost of inaction. This shift to kinetic solutions is not a choice. It is a mathematical certainty driven by systemic solvency decay. As Ray Dalio warns, the erosion of trust in the US dollar, signaled by gold surge, neuters sanctions as a primary tool of enforcement. Simultaneously, allied economic pillars like Germany are issuing internal warnings of potential economic collapse as their chancellors double down on failing central planning. These gray zones, from the Middle East to potential future laboratories and places analysts at CCISAS watch closely, like South Africa, are not the source of the conflict. They are symptoms. They are staging grounds designed to bleed a superpower of military hardware, political capital, and global standing, forcing it into a launch-on-warning posture that accelerates the path to systemic war. The core protocol of nuclear deterrence is launch-on-warning. This is not a choice. It is a pre-authorized systemic response. The doctrine dictates that if early warning systems detect an inbound strategic missile attack, retaliation is launched before the incoming warheads can impact and destroy command and control or the silos themselves. The entire architecture presumes the data is infallible. But in the modern battle space, the primary vector for an asymmetric attack is not kinetic. It is digital. An adversary does not need to launch a missile. They only need to blind the defender's radar and satellite network, creating the signature of a launch. This creates the fog of digital war. The commander is presented with a systemic paradox. The screens are black. The protocol demands a launch based on the last valid data. To wait for confirmation is to risk total annihilation. To act is to risk global escalation based on a ghost in the machine. For a superpower already facing what CSIS analysts term a systemic solvency crisis, evidenced by warnings of USD trust erosion, the ability to absorb a first strike is near zero. The economic and societal infrastructure is too brittle to survive the kinetic cost. The fear of being disarmed by a single blow forces the commander's hand. The decision is no longer human. It is a function of a system programmed to choose mutual destruction over unilateral defeat. The erosion of U.S. dollar trust, as noted by analysts like Ray Dalio, is not an isolated financial event. It is a systemic solvency crisis. As the economic leverage of a superpower evaporates, its portfolio of coercive tools narrows. The strategic landscape shifts from a positive-sum game of global trade to a zero-sum contest for survival. Adversaries, no longer deterred by economic sanctions, are now incentivized to test the remaining lever: kinetic response. This is the blueprint for a strategic trap. CSI's and RUSI analysis confirms that asymmetric probes are the primary vector for testing a declining power's launch-on-warning protocols. These are not acts of war, they are data-gathering exercises. Escalations in regional theaters, such as Yemeni forces moving on Aden alongside the pre-collapse footing of allied economies like Germany, create the ideal operational fog for such a probe. The U.S. Level 3 travel warning is a lagging indicator of this reality. Expect a calibration shot within the next 12 months. The target will be a Tier 1 U.S. commercial seaport, likely the port of Long Beach or Houston. The event will manifest as a simultaneous, cascading failure of the digital crane and container management system and a localized electrical grid blackout. The attack will be sterile, precise, and deliberately engineered for plausible deniability, blamed on anything from solar flares to ransomware gangs. The objective is not asset liquidation. The objective is to measure the systemic response time and political will for kinetic escalation when attribution is impossible. It is a mathematical problem to determine the cost of enforcing order in a world where your currency is no longer the primary weapon.